The studio lights were warm, almost soothing, the kind designed to make everything feel friendly and harmless, but beneath them the air had begun to tighten. Sylvester Stallone sat at the table with the familiar half-smile that had carried him through decades of interviews, red carpets, and skeptical questions. His hands were folded, thick fingers resting against one another, the posture of someone used to being watched. Around him, the hosts laughed and nodded, the conversation flowing easily as it always did on live television, skimming across movies, politics, culture, and whatever headline happened to be buzzing that morning. Joy Behar leaned back in her chair, eyes sharp with amusement, tossing out a remark that drew laughter from the audience. It was framed as a joke, light and clever on the surface, but it landed with a subtle sting. Stallone chuckled politely, the corners of his mouth lifting as instinct demanded, yet his eyes didn't quite follow. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, the kind that only someone who's spent years reading rooms could feel. He shifted slightly, adjusting his jacket, inhaling slowly through his nose. The conversation moved on, or at least tried to. Another question came his way, something about legacy, about how he felt looking back at his career now. Stallone answered smoothly, talking about gratitude, about luck, about the people who helped him along the way. He spoke with humility, but there was an undercurrent there, a tension that hadn't been present when he first sat down. Joy jumped back in, her tone playful but pointed, referencing the earlier comment again, this time with a sharper edge, framing it as a broader observation about men like him, about bravado, about outdated ideas. A ripple of laughter rolled through the audience, thinner than before. Stallone's smile faded, he leaned forward just an inch, elbows nearing the table, eyes fixed on Joy. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, almost calm enough to be mistaken for agreement. He questioned the premise of her joke, gently at first, asking whether it was fair to reduce decades of work and struggle to a punchline. The studio quieted slightly, the laughter dissolving into an uneasy murmur. Joy responded quickly, brushing it off, insisting it was all in good fun. She smiled, but there was a flash of challenge in her eyes. Stallone nodded, as if accepting that explanation, but something had shifted. His shoulders squared, his jaw tightening as he continued, explaining how often humor like that landed differently depending on who was telling it and who was expected to laugh along. He wasn't angry yet, not outwardly, but there was an intensity in his gaze that drew the cameras closer. The audience leaned in. This wasn't scripted banter anymore. The other hosts glanced between them, sensing the turn, one of them attempting to interject with a light comment to ease the mood. It didn't stick. Joy replied again, firmer now, pushing back, suggesting that public figures had to learn to take a joke, especially ones who built careers on toughness and bravado. That word, bravado, hung in the air. Stallone exhaled sharply, a sound caught by his microphone. He straightened in his chair, the movement slow and deliberate, as if he were rising to his feet in the middle of a ring. His voice grew louder, not a shout but a forceful projection that filled the studio. He talked about how toughness wasn't an act for him, how it wasn't something he put on for cameras. He spoke about being dismissed early in his career, about being told he didn't look right, didn't sound right, didn't belong. As he spoke, the room seemed to shrink. The audience was silent now, eyes fixed on him. Joy tried to jump in, but he lifted a hand slightly, not aggressively. Just enough to signal he wasn't finished. He spoke about sleeping in bus stations, about selling his dog to get by, about being laughed out of rooms long before anyone applauded him. His words came faster, fueled by something deeper than the moment, years of memory surfacing all at once. The cameras caught every flicker of emotion across his face, the tightening around his eyes, the brief shake of his head as if reliving moments he'd long buried. He wasn't performing. This was raw, unpolished, the kind of honesty rarely seen on a morning talk show. The studio audience shifted in their seats, some nodding, some wide-eyed, all aware they were witnessing something that couldn't be rewound. Joy responded again, quieter this time, suggesting that no one was denying his struggle, that humor was simply part of the show. Her words sounded measured, but the earlier ease was gone. Stallone shook his head, frustration finally breaking through. He talked about respect, about the difference between laughing with someone and laughing at them. His hand came down on the table, not violently, but with enough force to make the microphones pop and the sound echo through the room. A collective gasp swept across the audience. Somewhere off stage, a producer whispered urgently into a headset. Stallone didn't seem to notice. He was locked into the moment, eyes blazing, voice unwavering. He spoke about how people loved the idea of resilience until it challenged their assumptions, how easy it was to dismiss grit when you'd never had to rely on it to survive. The other hosts sat frozen, hands clasped, unsure whether to step in or stay out of the line of fire. The atmosphere was electric, brittle, like glass stretched too thin. Stallone paused for a moment, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling. For a second, it seemed like he might pull back, soften, let the moment pass. Instead, he leaned forward again, his voice dropping, more dangerous in its calm. He asked Joy directly if she understood what it felt like to be counted out completely, to have your worth decided before you ever spoke. The question wasn't rhetorical. It hung there, heavy and unanswered, as the studio fell into a silence so complete it felt deafening. Joy Behar opened her mouth, then closed it again, the practiced rhythm of live television suddenly disrupted. For the first time that morning, she hesitated. The pause felt enormous. Stallone remained leaned forward, hands planted on the table, eyes locked on her, not hostile but unyielding. The silence pressed in from all sides, broken only by the faint hum of studio equipment and the distant shuffle of someone backstage moving too quickly. Joy finally spoke, her voice quieter, more careful than before. She said she understood struggle in her own way, that everyone carried battles the audience never saw. It was a measured answer, diplomatic, the kind designed to calm rather than confront. But it didn't land. Stallone listened, nodding once, slowly, then shook his head. He wasn't dismissing her experiences, he was rejecting the comparison. He explained that pain wasn't a competition, but respect wasn't optional either. The tension spiked again, sharper now because the room knew there was no easy laugh to smooth it over. One of the co-hosts tried to step in, offering a gentle segue back to Stallone's latest project, her voice bright and forced. Stallone turned toward her briefly, offering a small, apologetic smile, then looked back at Joy. "I'm almost done," he said, not loudly, but with an authority that cut through everything else. He stood up then, the movement sudden enough to send another murmur through the audience. At full height, he seemed even more imposing, not because he was angry, but because he was utterly present. He adjusted his jacket out of habit, a reflex from years of public appearances, then spoke again, addressing the room rather than just Joy. He talked about how easy it was for moments like this to be clipped, edited, turned into jokes or weapons online. He said he didn't care about that. What he cared about was leaving the truth on the table, even if it made people uncomfortable. Joy shifted in her seat, crossing and uncrossing her arms. She attempted one more interjection, her tone defensive now, explaining that the show thrived on debate, that no harm had been intended. Stallone nodded again, acknowledging her point, but his patience had thinned. He said intention didn't erase impact, that words lingered long after laughter faded. His voice cracked just slightly on that last sentence, a tiny fracture that made it hit harder. Backstage, producers were now fully visible at the edge of the set, hands raised in subtle signals, eyes wide with alarm. A commercial break loomed, but no one dared interrupt him outright. The cameras stayed tight on his face, then cut briefly to the hosts, capturing their unease, the dawning realization that this moment had slipped beyond control. Stallone took a breath, deep and steady, and the room seemed to breathe with him. He spoke about his children watching moments like this, about what it taught them when adults brushed off pain as humor. He said he wasn't asking for special treatment, just basic dignity. The words weren't dramatic, but they were devastating in their simplicity. Joy looked up at him, her expression a mix of frustration and something closer to reflection. She nodded once, slowly, as if conceding a point without fully surrendering her stance. The audience remained silent, caught between admiration and shock. This wasn't entertainment anymore, it was exposure. Finally, Stallone stepped back from the table. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something heavier, almost weary. He said he'd said what he came to say. He thanked the audience for listening, his voice softer now, then turned toward the exit. As he took his first step away, Joy called his name. He paused but didn't turn around. She said she respected his journey, that perhaps the moment had gone further than intended. It wasn't an apology, not quite, but it wasn't nothing. Stallone stood there for a second longer, shoulders rising as he exhaled. Then he nodded once, still facing away, and continued walking. The audience erupted then, applause crashing through the studio like a delayed reaction finally released. Some people stood, others clapped uncertainly, a few wiped at their eyes. The host sat frozen as Stallone disappeared backstage, the sound of applause following him like a wave he refused to ride. As soon as he was off camera, the atmosphere shifted again. Crew members rushed past him, voices overlapping, someone asking if he was okay, another apologizing, another urging him toward a quiet room. Stallone waved them off gently, his face composed but drained. He leaned briefly against a wall, closing his eyes for just a moment, as if the weight of what had happened had finally landed. Back in the studio, the host struggled to regain footing. Joy straightened her papers, her hands trembling just enough to be noticeable. She addressed the audience, acknowledging the intensity of the exchange, trying to frame it as a powerful conversation rather than a breakdown. Her voice wavered, but she pushed through, professionalism reasserting itself inch by inch. The show cut to commercial at last, the bright music jarringly cheerful after what had just unfolded. In living rooms across the country, viewers stared at their screens, stunned. Phones buzzed instantly, clips already circulating, opinions forming in real time. Some hailed Stallone's honesty, calling it brave, overdue. Others accused him of overreacting, of hijacking the show. The debate ignited within minutes, lines drawn sharply, fiercely. Backstage, Stallone sat alone, staring at his hands. He flexed his fingers, grounding himself, reminding himself where he was. A producer approached cautiously, thanking him for coming on, apologizing again for how things escalated. Stallone nodded, accepting the words without comment. He wasn't angry anymore. If anything, he seemed relieved, as though a long-held breath had finally been released. When he eventually left the building, cameras and reporters were already gathering outside, shouting questions he didn't answer. He slipped into a waiting car, the door closing with a solid, final thud. As the vehicle pulled away, the city blurred past the window, and for the first time that day, there was silence. Inside the studio, long after the applause faded and the lights dimmed, people would talk about that moment in hushed tones. Some would call it explosive, others uncomfortable, others necessary. But everyone would agree on one thing: it was unforgettable. A routine morning show had cracked open something real, something raw, and no amount of editing or spin could fully contain it.